Hey, hey, this is Ed Gallo, partial owner and head of the wrestling department at the Fight Site. That's the fight-site.com because apparently the fightsite.com with no hyphen is not an available domain. It's not even like we have the option to buy it. You like just can't buy it. I don't know why. So you'll live with the hyphen. I mean, who's really typing in URLs in full anyway? You know how to find us. And that's fightsite.com on Twitter, spelling out .com. Because we're quirky like that. Cool. So, yeah, it's me, Ed. If you don't know me, which would be interesting considering you're listening to my podcast and how else did you find it? Uh, I've been in this MMA writing sphere for, let's call it about 2 years now. I was basically just bored and wanted to talk to people about MMA, so I started writing for MMA Sucka in about January of 2018. Yeah, January 2018. And yep, just didn't really know anything. I'd been watching MMA for about 10 years at that point, but I still didn't really know what I was talking about. So I just started writing, mostly just like fun stuff, just trying to get people interested in certain fighters and, uh, gain appreciation for this and that. But it wasn't really analysis at that point. And it's good that it wasn't analysis at that point because I was bad at it. Uh, yeah, over time, I just started to trend toward analysis, and luckily, I made some really good friends on Twitter and through my, meeting colleagues at various websites. And they helped me out and they helped me learn. And I feel like I've gotten to a pretty good point as an analyst. I still have a lot of room to grow. But yeah, I feel pretty good about that. So I've been publishing analysis that I'm proud of for uh, a good year and a half now. So maybe the first year of my MMA writing was pretty rough, but I mean, some of those pieces are still kind of enjoyable, but it's not anything that I'd link anyone to. Um, but yeah, so that's like my background, and then that's for writing. As far as in general martial arts stuff like that, uh, I mean, I grew up doing karate a little bit, just totally capitalist, not real karate. I didn't like spar very often or do any like point fighting tournaments. I was a kid, I mean, it's just kid karate. But yeah, you still learn like kicking mechanics and a couple other things. But I did that for maybe 5, 6 years, and then like nothing for a while until high school. And I saw the UFC on TV, just channel flipping, summer 2010. And yeah, it was like, okay, that's it. I want to do that. Just first sight. It wasn't even like a good card too. It was the Ultimate Fighter 11 finale. Court McGee was fighting Chris McRae, but I think the fight that was on that when I turned it on was Rich Antonito versus Jamie Yeager, which was also not a good fight, but I don't know, just something about it. I'd never seen it before, and it was interesting to me. Sorry, I have a bit of a cold. Uh, but yeah, so I saw it and I was hooked, and I looked into gyms for about a week, and I was like, this is expensive, and I couldn't drive yet at that point, obviously, and my parents didn't want to drive me that far, so it just wasn't happening. Uh, so my best friend was a lifelong wrestler, and he basically just told me, hey, if you want to get good at this stuff, like those guys are all wrestlers, right? And he got me wrestling, and I did one full season JV in Pennsylvania, and it was great and terrible at the same time. Definitely grueling. Definitely broke my nose. Got a skin infection. All the classic wrestling stuff. I had a really full experience. I stuck around most of the season. I didn't stay for postseason because obviously I didn't even have the opportunity to try to qualify after sectionals or anything like that because I wasn't JV. Funny enough, I do have one varsity match on my record because they used my name or like they registered me. I don't know what they did, but like they said to whoever was at this tournament, this holiday tournament, that I was there or that I was going. And they didn't tell me and they didn't bring me and then they just forfeit my match. So I don't know why they did that. Obviously, I wasn't good, so like they didn't need to bring me or anything, but yeah, so I have this one forfeit loss on my record for varsity, so But my point is that I didn't wrestle very long, and I wasn't a good wrestler. So let's just get that out of the way. That in order to understand wrestling and like analyze wrestling, it takes a lot of time, but you don't have to have been good. So let's just get that right out there. In fact, I think that people who were good wrestlers tend not to be this type of analyst just because they have to spend so much time being good at wrestling and they learn about their game. Yeah, maybe they're breaking down opponents, but they just can't obsess and spend all the time watching footage that someone who isn't training to be good can. I just think their mind is in another place. So to be a huge nerd is probably the most important requirement for being a good analyst. You really have to be someone who enjoys, excuse me, spending a lot of time looking at the same 10-second clip over and over again, explaining to yourself what's happening, explaining to other people what's happening. And then once you can kind of start to understand sequences like that, which you won't be able to do on your own. You'll probably have to, you know, get some instructional help out there, and YouTube's great for that for wrestling. Uh, yeah, you'll have to get some understanding of mechanics of moves. Like even though I wrestled, I didn't know how every move worked, obviously. So I had to still look that up. Uh, but yeah, I mean, you have to be able to watch something over and over again, and once you understand the mechanics and how things are working, just in a very flat sense, then you can start to look at the bigger picture into how did they get to that position, why did they get to that position, what's the dynamic of the full match, and that can really help. And that's just for pure wrestling. For MMA, there's so many other layers on top of that. But I could go on all day about like how do you do analysis, how do you become an analyst. Danny Martin, my colleague at the fight site, has a really awesome like his first metagame article is basically about like how do you do analysis for MMA, and it's great. So I recommend reading that one. I recommend reading everything by my colleagues at the fight site. They're just unbelievable. They make me feel stupid pretty regularly, but every once in a while I get them on something. So small victories. But yeah. After wrestling, I mean that season was cool and all, but and I wanted to keep wrestling, but I didn't have the most supportive coaching environment, and like they didn't really make me enjoy it that much. I didn't really want to stay on that team. I don't think it was really wrestling I didn't like. I think it was just being on that team, and yeah, and like my best friend who had been wrestling his whole life, he quit after that season. A lot of people quit after that season. It just wasn't great, which is a shame because if I did stick around, I would have actually ended up having a different head coach and maybe enjoying it a bit more and finishing out high school. But uh, another teacher at the school sponsored an MMA club, and basically that became my life for the next 2 years of high school. I mean, that was all the time, every day. I think I ended up being like co-president at the end, which isn't really anything, but yeah, we just had like structured practices for someone who by someone who's training to be a pro fighter. And we learned a lot, and we definitely shouldn't have been allowed to do it because we were like sparring in the cafeteria, but it was great. And then in college at Pitt, there was another MMA club, so I did that for 4 years. And yeah, I mean, I never really got good because I didn't take it that seriously, where I was like training a lot and like getting in good shape and really drilling and stuff like that. But I soaked up a lot of knowledge, and I got good at explaining things to people because I do, trend towards leadership and I like to run practices. So I think maybe that played a role. But yeah, I guess that's sort of the really basic breakdown of how I arrived at this point. Um, but yeah, so wrestling for MMA, that is the topic of this podcast. This is the pilot. Um, if you've read any of my work on Bloody Elbow, that is kind of my main thing. Is this wrestling for MMA series of articles, and the idea behind it is that there are wrestlers in MMA, and some of them are good at wrestling in an MMA context. Some of them are less good at wrestling in an MMA context. And while their baseline skill and style as a wrestler certainly plays a factor, what's more important, what I've noticed is can they link their striking with their wrestling? And that doesn't just mean, okay, did they understand how to do a combination or a series of strikes that ends in them getting up in a position for a takedown? Yes, sort of. But also, is their striking systematic in a way where they're setting themselves up consistently to be in the wrestling situations they want to be? For example, if you are an excellent upper body artist, if you love to throw from over unders, let's say, or you like to throw from double unders. I don't know. Or let's say you like to go from rear standing and go belly to back. I don't know. I don't know what you like to do. Uh, how are you gonna get to those positions? Are you gonna barrel forward and try to grab the clinch? It's probably not gonna work. And if it does work, you're most likely either going to end up on the cage or just not with the clinch situation that you want, because it's just not precise. And when you're reaching like that, you're hardly ever going to have success, or at least not the kind of success that you are aiming for. Plus, if you're fighting someone who's actually elite, they should be able to punish you pretty badly for rushing at them with your arms out. So you can't just be a wrestler and know how to do wrestling and say, okay, I'm just going to run at them and get my hands on them and that's it. Uh, Today, that probably won't work. Even if you're like a leg attack artist, which gives you a little more room to attack from the outside without a real setup, it only goes so far. Um, my first time recording this podcast, all of the audio didn't work, so hopefully it's working this time. But the first time I mentioned Boris Novachkov. So Boris Novachkov wrestled for Cal Poly. He was national finalist, D1 wrestler, obviously. And then he continued in freestyle. I want to say for Bulgaria. I apologize if that's not true. And this is the second time I've said that without checking. But yeah, so he wrestled in freestyle, and he was like world level. And I don't want to say world class. I mean, he was medaling at the world championship level of talent. And he didn't really have many accolades to his name, uh, but in freestyle, but he was totally one of those guys. Uh, the best example of that is that he wrestled Soslan Romanov, a North Ossetian for Russia. He was the Olympic champion in 2016. And Novachkov wrestled him around that time, and they went super close, super close. And the scoring of the match was pretty weird, and I thought there was an argument for Novachkov actually having a winning score, but I digress. So he's that good at freestyle, which means his leg attacks are as elite as they come, I think you could say. Uh, he's a great wrestler, great wrestler. Um, he took an MMA fight in Bellator. He had his pro debut in Bellator, and he looked like he had no idea what he was doing. Like, zero clue about MMA. And Boris, if you're listening for some reason, I'm sorry, but you clearly didn't learn MMA for that fight. I think that's fair to say. You didn't try to strike, you kind of just stood there. Uh, and when you tried to wrestle, you just didn't have a way to enter the range where leg attacks would have been effective. He was shooting from way too far out. He was clearing an impressive amount of distance on his shots, but even then, it's not enough most of the time. And his opponent wasn't really anybody. It's not like he was fighting anyone great. Um, it's your pro debut. I mean, and Bellator is known for bringing these guys up pretty slowly, except Aaron Pico, which is a whole other story. But yeah, Novachkov couldn't get anything done. He lost his pro debut just because he didn't have any way of getting to his wrestling attacks. So that's a really obvious example. It's like, yes, you can't just shoot from the outside all the time and have no MMA game. That's not going to work, even if you have great leg attacks. And just for context, that Novachkov didn't like fall off a cliff, and that's why he started competing in freestyle again recently, and he went super close. Like, I think he lost by 1 point to Opan Sat, who is like a high-level Russian national guy who wrestles for Turkey now. And he changed his name to like Chengizhan Erdogan. I don't know how to pronounce the first name, but yeah, so that's the guy. Snovachikov's still pretty high level in freestyle, and I think he's. Well, I don't know what's going to happen now with the Olympics probably being canceled, but yeah, I would like to see him stick in freestyle just because of how poorly he handled his MMA transition. So yeah, that's just an example of somebody who they have their thing in wrestling and they don't have any semblance of getting to their attacks. And that's like the very, very obvious baseline, ground zero example. Uh, let's look at someone like Gregor Gillespie, who's had a lot of success in MMA with his wrestling. Uh, I did write that article. I did write Wrestling for MMA Gregor Gillespie for Bloody Elbow. Um, and I think the only thing I can say is that situationally, he has his moments. He knows how to do reactive shots, which is very important. Not everyone needs to be able to do reactive shots, but if you're someone who isn't good off the back foot yet, which most fighters, especially early in their careers, especially if they're not striking based to start with, they're not going to be good off the back foot. That rarely happens. Like Aldo is like the only time that's ever happened where like a grappler comes to MMA and like within a couple of years he's good off the back foot. It's almost unheard of. So yes, obviously he's bad off the back foot, but he's got reactive shots. So if you pressure him hard, if you use a lot of forward motion, he's gonna double leg you or he's gonna single leg, and he's got great finishes from those positions. Once he's in a good position on an entry, then he's gonna finish. Uh, but if he's shooting from too far out, he can get stuffed by like Jason Gonzalez. I think that's the guy who like looks like Carlos Condit and has the takedown defense of Carlos Condit, and that guy wasn't getting taken down every time by Gregor Gillespie. So even when you're a four-time All-American and a national champion like Gillespie is, people can still shut you down if you don't have the striking to back up uh, your game. And on the lead, he has a couple things he's learning. Like he can weave from strikes into takedown entries, which is great. One of the concepts that I talk about a few times is like the art of disguise, masking your entries. Uh, so level changing strikes is usually the way that happens. So if you throw a jab and you dip on your jab, it's just part of the mechanics of your jab. If you're level changing on your jab or you're throwing your jab to the body, let's make it threefold. Let's say you throw your jab and you kind of dip on it, and you throw it to the head, and then you do a full level change to throw it to the body, and you use a similar motion to enter on your double leg, to enter on your single leg, whatever it is. Uh, that's awesome because that those all play off of each other. So your opponent won't know based on your movement whether or not you're jabbing head, jabbing body, or shooting. And you can do that with your rear hand. You can do that with a lot of different things. So Gillespie is starting to pick up on those concepts, but that's just wrestling setups. It's not like he has a striking game yet where that's just a part of it. It's like that's a trick he knows, which is important. You should have tricks. That's like step one, is to figure out what you can do to make takedowns available. Um, Yoel Romero, for example, here's an example of very high level tricks. He doesn't really have a cage wrestling game. He never has. I don't think he ever will, either defensively or offensively, but he can finish a shot quickly on the cage. Brad Tavares' fight is a really good example of him having a way to get to those cage wrestling positions where he can finish quickly. He threw like a jumping front kick into a long right hand, and he covered like half the cage with it, and bounced Tavares off the cage. And as soon as Tavares hit the cage, he was on his legs. It wasn't even a deep entry. It, like wasn't a. It was a pretty shallow level change. He's pretty high on the legs, but he just barreled into him and yanked him off the cage. And he did that several times. And it was a reliable entry for him. And it wasn't like any like cohesive striking attack, even though he was landing some of those blitzing shots. But I think that's the point. You need to have things you know you can do that are going to lead to wrestling situations that you want. If we go back to that first example of the upper body guy, uh, someone like Juicy Formiga is someone you might want to study. So I just finished my third article on Formiga this week. Should be coming out today if this podcast is also released today, which is Thursday. Um, yeah, Formiga has the system of clinch entries, which are really awesome. So basically, he plays with range and he entry feints with his jab. So he's all about his lead hand techniques, and I'll get to his other system of leg attacks in a second. But for clinch entries, he's all about these in and out jabbing game, feinting it, coming in and out. It's very layered. It's very versatile because it's such a simple tool. He can use it in a lot of different ways. And basically, he tries to draw people in. And when he draws you in and you extend, he'll, hop back into range with his left hook. And if he level changes, that left hook becomes an underhook because he's throwing it around your body. Does that make sense? So earlier in his career, he wouldn't be doing that manipulation of range. He'd kind of just settle into one spot and he'd wait for you to enter. And usually you're entering in a way where you are throwing a punch at his head, so the window for an underhook is there because your arm is high. Pretty simple, right? Basically, just ducks and hooks in that general direction, and ta-da, he's got an underhook. Uh, and just with punching mechanics, most of the time people have their other hand high too, so you can duck and get double underhooks and shrug to the back, and that's his back take. Um, so even though it has holes, and I explain that in those articles, Even though that system has holes, it worked. It worked really well because he just had something he could do and that was sustainable and that he could repeat. It was able to be replicated, and that's like, statistically valid. I don't know. I don't know math, but that the same principles that apply to any other trade are there. You have to be able to do things that you can do over and over again that are going to work in some way consistently. Uh, so yeah, that's kind of in a long ranting way the kind of stuff I talk about when I say wrestling for MMA. Like, what can you do in terms of striking to make your wrestling work best? And in wrestling, I think people outside the wrestling world don't have a strong understanding of like how wrestling actually works. You wrestle in your practices, and a lot of people have wrestling experience, but I don't know how deep the wrestling instruction is in, say, like a jiu-jitsu school. I think you learn takedowns and you learn the mechanics of certain positions, and you learn a lot, but I don't think you learn how to have a wrestling game. Like when I watch jiu-jitsu tournaments, it's a lot of hanging out in collar ties and people going ear to ear and just kind of sitting there and waiting for the timing, and okay, I'm gonna pull and I'm gonna go on this high crotch, stuff like that. That's cool, but in the idea there of how you're pulling the trigger is fine, but you didn't really set that up over the long term. There's no like game that's coming together to get you to that point. And I get how in jujitsu it doesn't really pay off in the long run to invest time in that just because people are going to pull guard anyway, so why bother? I've had that experience many times where I'm like, I'm gonna wrestle this guy and it's gonna be great. I'm gonna get takedowns. It's gonna feel good because I have a lot of unfulfilled takedown dreams from not really wrestling that much, and I like taking people down in jiu-jitsu tournaments because I'm like, aha, my experience meant something. But a lot of the times people just they see me in a low stance. I'm like, okay, I'm pulling guard, and I'm like, gosh darn it. So I feel that pain. But in practice, you can get people to wrestle with you, right? Uh, so I do a lot of breakdowns of wrestling matches, a lot of freestyle, and even something simple, like a double leg. I think people think that a double leg is just a shot you take from the outside and that's it, and you just do it and ta-da. And I don't think a lot of people get how you can set up a game around a double leg. Um, so I'll give you three different examples of double leg artists in wrestling, how they differ, and how those principles might translate to MMA. So let's start with Jordan Burroughs. So Jordan Burroughs and my next example, Frank Chamizo, are pretty similar. So Jordan Burroughs, everyone knows, one of the greatest American wrestlers in history, um, five-time world and Olympic champion, has two or three bronze medals on top of that at the world level. Uh, Fantastic person, fantastic wrestler, and prolific double legger. Uh, on its face, just purely at the core, he has the attributes to be a good double legger. He's explosive, he's fast, he's strong, he's got good timing on it, he's tough, so he can like shoot with his face and like get through your cross face or shoot through your hands and head and face and chest and knees, whatever he needs to go through. So that's all there. But on top of that, he's got a system. And I really recommend checking out DPS breakdowns on YouTube. He has two Jordan Burroughs double leg studies that really shed light on how much work goes into getting these takedowns. Um, but at its core, the main principle for getting these double legs is manipulating level changes. So, very simply, you can just be in your stance, fake levels, and kind of look like you're stepping for a double leg, and you can just do that in your motion, in your stance over and over again. And if you threaten with a couple actual shots, your opponent should respect it enough to say, okay, when you change levels, I need to change levels because if I don't, I'm open for the double leg because my legs are right there. Um, so you're getting lower than them, you're getting that line at the legs, and they need to lower with you. So the point is that eventually you should be able to read that well enough where you can level change, you can get them level changing, and then when they start, they're just naturally going to start to come back up. When they come back up, that line is there, and you're still down, ready to shoot. And that's kind of what Burroughs does. And what's beautiful about what Burroughs does is that he has this crazy shot where he can like go off his knees. It doesn't really matter what position he's in. He can shoot like a crazy cannonball double leg from any position. So, but he's not just spamming it because he's still gonna get caught with underhooks. He's still gonna get reattacked. Still gonna get hit with go behinds if he just shoots it from the outside with no setup. He's getting that level changing action going first, and that's just from the outside. And then if you add in that people are tying up with him, he's fighting heavy on the head. He's clearing ties. He's creating new dynamics there too, which is I think a little bit more of what Frank Chamizo does. Chamizo is weird, and it's probably Camizo. I'm sorry, to Philippe, who's the only person who's gonna yell at me for Italian pronunciation. But he is Cuban, so I think it's both. Uh, both ways work. But anyway, Frank Camizo, uh, two-time world champion, Olympic bronze, world bronze, excellent wrestler. Um, him, Burroughs, and Sidakov of Russia are like the trio at the top right now at 74 kilograms. But I wouldn't really call Chumizo a double leg wrestler. He just has one. But he is someone else who has that like quick feinting motion where he'll flurry on people basically just with feints, uh, up and down, level changing, and he's much more agile. He's faster. He's a little smaller than Jordan Burroughs, so he's showing a lot of different looks. Not only is he straight level changing, he's also faking sweep singles. He's coming off at an angle. He's on the head. He's pushing. He's faking a lot of different shots. And not only does that open up the double leg for him when people react to the other shots, it opens up the other shots for him when people react to the double leg. Um, I didn't mention this name already, but tangentially, Yoel Romero is someone who plays with this kind of linear up and down level changing concept because he's all about the snap down. In wrestling, he was all about the snap down. Super heavy on the head, super powerful, obviously. So Yoel Romero was not an outside operator in wrestling. He was an infighter, more or less. Uh, he would snap people on their faces and he would take go behinds. And eventually, people said, okay, I don't want to get snapped on my face, so I'm going to resist that. So they're resisting it, and he's snapping. Two things can happen. One, he's just going to wear you down over time, and you're going to get snapped on your face anyway. Two, he'll snap you down a little bit, and then you'll be fighting it, and you'll stand back up, and there, oh, look, there's the legs. So Romero became a prolific ankle picker. So he's heavy on the head with one arm, and he's reaching across the ankle with the other arm. Um, and he can be doing that off the head, so he can let go and clear and shoot the ankle pick. Excuse me. Or he can hang down the head and just bring himself closer to the ankle and just keep the head and then switch to the ankle. So either way, he's bringing himself down there, and there's not much you can do about it. And that was kind of his whole system, was ankle picks and snap downs and go behinds. He ankle picked Kale Sanderson, who's like the ankle pick god. Um, he was also really good upper body, and he had his whole system there. But yeah, eventually, I think I will dedicate an entire episode to talking about why Yoel Romero's wrestling is not what it should be in MMA, but I don't really think I have time for that rant right now. If you're one of our patrons and you're on our Discord server, you've heard a lot of that from me already, but I'll make it public soon. I did also write Wrestling for MMA, Yoel Romero, but I think I focused on the positives there. Yeah. So one more double legger who kind of is the exception to the rule is someone like Nate Jackson. He wrestles for Indiana. I think he was an All-American. He beat Bo Nickel during the regular season, and he now wrestles for the NJRTC, which is like Princeton and Rutgers area wrestlers, senior level athletes in freestyle. And he has this crazy double leg where he can start it from wherever he wants. And I've only watched him at the Medved and I think it was the either the Bill Farrell or the Dave Schultz Invitational this year. But he was just like double legging people from space, and there was nothing they could do about it. And they were like getting their underhooks, and they were like sprawling, and they're doing everything you're supposed to do, and he was just blowing them over, um, and just whenever he wanted. So, and to like decent guys, he did it to a world silver medalist, I believe, Boris Makoyev, who beat Jaden Cox. And Makoyev has been on a serious downturn in the past couple of years, although he's making a comeback in the past month or so. But yeah, when Nate Jackson wrestled him, he blew the doors off of him. Uh, so someone like that, yeah, maybe I'd like to see them in MMA just because Nate Jackson could probably just not learn striking and just double leg people. But that's a rare outlier. You know what I mean? That's almost never gonna happen. Even someone like people think like Chad Mendez is like the oh my god this guy's double is amazing. Chad Mendez can't just shoot from the outside against anyone good and take them down. There's a lot that goes into it, and if you want to read about that, there's also a Wrestling for MMA Chad Mendez article. Um, I've written about most of my favorite fighters who are wrestlers in their wrestling games. Um, but yeah, this is just me ranting for the most part. I don't really want to go into anything in depth too much right now. It's funny, in my first recording, I said a lot about Khabib Nurmagomedov and his why his wrestling is translated, or how his wrestling is translated, or why he's an effective wrestler. I don't know if I want to go into that rant, but maybe I will because this whole podcast is actually just a response to one of our Patreon questions. So we have the fight site has a Patreon account set up, obviously. $5 to get into our Discord server, which is where we put most of our content, honestly, most of our exclusive content, I'll say, which is like live podcasts and just hanging out with us all day. It's a fun time. We have a nice little community going. You don't have to join it if you don't want, but I've really been enjoying it. The $10 tier is what entitles you to some different content, but also it allows you to ask questions to be answered in podcast form and such. And we take a long time. If you saw my video with Ryan on our YouTube channel, we took about 40 minutes to answer one question. So we take it seriously. So your money goes to good use. Plus, I mean, we don't run ads on the site, um, and we're trying to never run ads on the site. So this is our only form of income, so please support the site in some way, uh, monetarily. That would be great. Or at least share our stuff if you're not going to do that. Because we think we're doing a good thing here. We'd like to keep it going, and we'd like to be able to pay our writers. That'd be awesome. Um, but yeah, the question was, why have some wrestlers' styles translated better to MMA than others? And Khabib was one who's was listed as someone whose style translated well. And I don't know what Khabib's wrestling style was before he came to MMA, so it's hard to comment. But the reason his wrestling is effective in MMA is because of his mat wrestling, right? I mean, I have a lot to say about his neutral game, and I think if you read that Wrestling for MMA Khabib Nurmagomedov article that I wrote, you can see a lot of my criticisms there, and I'm being harsh on him. And people often have weird reactions to criticizing undefeated fighters because obviously if they're undefeated, then everything they're doing is perfect, and it all works. Like it's all been opponent specific so far, uh, but I don't want to rant on that too much. I'll just say that there's a lot wrong with his neutral game, which just means like his takedowns in open space, just getting the fight to the ground. It works, but I mean Conor McGregor had half the right ideas in terms of takedown defense and very nearly denied him in that opening sequence and denied him several times in the third round when Khabib was a little more tired and was trying some reactive shots and different looks, and they weren't working out so well for him. So he is nowhere near unstoppable on the feet as a neutral wrestler. Al Iaquinta was limp legging out of several single legs, which actually really took a toll physically, just because Khabib puts a lot into those shots to just get a bite on the leg so he can work towards his finish. That's kind of the principle with his open space attacks, because he's not really going to shoot a double on anyone in open space. And there's this weird thing with Khabib where people don't want to pressure him because they're like, oh, he's a wrestler. And if I push forward too much, he's going to reactive takedown me. But he's almost never done that. Maybe he's done it once to like Pat Healy, I think. But it's not something he does. I don't think it's something you're going to see him do just because on the back foot, he likes to lean back, and he's in no position to shoot a takedown when he's leaning back like that. So I don't really think it's something anyone has to be worried about, but maybe I'm wrong. Uh, but yeah, he likes to shoot that single leg, and it's like a hybrid between a low single and a sweep single. It's not really a good shot because he ends up on his knees and has to build back up to his base, which one is energy inefficient, and two, it gives the other person time to get out, which is what Ally Quinta did. Uh, but I think the whole point with him is that it's fast enough, and he has the strength and the motor and the core strength to build back up and finish it most of the time. And then he's on the mat, and he really only needs one takedown once he gets to the mat. And I would say his mat wrestling is mostly a grappling system. Like he takes ideas from folk style, like he does wrist rides and puts boots in, and he rides the hip, stuff like that. But I mean, it's a whole grappling system. I wouldn't really call it wrestling. People just call like controlling on the mat. They just call that wrestling. It's grappling once you hit the mat, in my opinion. And there's wrestling concepts I can point to. Um, but at the end of the day, I think it's a whole different explanation. Maybe that's just my way of copping out of having to write about grappling when I'm not as comfortable with it as I am with wrestling. But whatever. Some other people he talked about. He used Tyron Woodley as an example of someone whose wrestling hasn't translated well. Now, I can't speak to Woodley's wrestling game outside of MMA because I didn't really watch his matches, but I think Woodley has a case for having a game that would set up takedowns well just because he is so back foot counter heavy, and that's his whole game is based around getting people to walk into his rear hand. Um, that same concept should apply for a reactive shot. He would just have to show that look a little bit and show the body a little bit when he hits that counter. And then you have the level changing component. I mean, wrestlers and overhands go together so well. One, because it just athletically it works for them, functionally it works for them, but also it's a level changing strike. So people see a level change, they say, "Oh, takedown," and then it's an overhand, right? And same the other way. You can show the overhand and shoot a takedown. Really simple concepts like that are what works for wrestlers in MMA, just because the interplay with the masking of the movements. Um, it's really nice. It's a really nice way to fight. And that's like the first thing most wrestlers learn, and some don't. And you scratch your head and you say, why don't you do that? Um, I'm sure there's case specific answers to that. Um, but yeah, Tyron Woodley probably could add a reactive takedown to his arsenal, but I think it's just a matter of him being so single minded and this is how I'm going to win that's why he doesn't do that. That's the answer to why Woodley doesn't do a lot of things. I think he just has honed in on this one game plan, and sometimes it works, and more often against people who have functional games, it doesn't work. I mean, say what you will about him like getting wins over Wonder Boy, but his game didn't work against Wonder Boy. It's just that Wonder Boy's game wasn't really equipped to do anything after not falling into that trap. And then eventually he did fall into it because he's like, oh, I gotta make something happen. And boom, he got countered. but and Darren Till led with a lead uppercut, which is like one of the dumbest things you could do. Sorry, I actually like Darren Till too, but I don't know why he did that. Um, Gave him like the most obvious opening he could have. But yeah, so that's Woodley. He's Colby Covington as an example of someone whose game did translate well. I think a lot of folk style wrestlers, a lot of college wrestlers in America, excuse me, have high motors and are volume shooters, but aren't necessarily like clean leg attackers with the best mechanics or fundamentals, but they're just good athletes. And that usually sets them above a lot of the pack. I mean, that's all relative. Um, if you've like grappled with like a day one guy in jiu-jitsu who is a high school wrestler, sometimes you're shocked by how much more athletic they are than you, just because wrestling is one of those sports. And it's one of those sports where it's grueling to go through it, but also people who wrestle have been doing it their whole lives very often. If they got to any sort of high level, it's likely that they've been doing it since they were a little kid. And that just builds a different kind of strength. Um, I don't want to give examples because I'll just go straight towards Mongolian horse archers. Um, but yeah, that's kind of the idea there. Um, if anyone's ever been like guillotined in their own guard from a wrestler on top, they know what I mean. You just roll with these guys, and you're like, what is going on here? And that's like a good high school wrestler. When you get to these guys who are successful at the D1 level, like Colby Covington was, you're dealing with something different. It's just unbearable. And that's not to say he's, classes above everyone in the UFC. I mean, there's a lot of great athletes in the UFC. But I think just being athletic was a big part of it for him, and just having a great motor and being relatively strong and being able to push this attack has been good for him. And he has a game that revolves around it. I mean, he learned how to pressure fight. It's not the smartest or cleanest pressure, but he has a pressure game and he has his game of wrestling against the cage, and that's how he does it, and it works, and it's a system. That's what I mean. That's wrestling for MMA. He has a way to get to his positions that he wants, and there's issues with both the way he works in those positions and the way he gets there, but at least he has the idea going. which is what matters ultimately. So Colby Covington, Yoel was discussed. Ben Askren. I wrote a late career evaluation of Askren for the fight site. It was very negative, very critical, um, and for good reason, I think. So in wrestling, Askren was this guy who, relative to the other guys at the highest level, was not a great neutral attacker. He didn't really have a great takedown game, you would say. Compared to me, obviously, it's fantastic. But, compared to elite leg attackers, no, he's not really that guy. Um, but his whole thing was that he was a great mat wrestler, and he gave a new look that most people weren't ready for, which is, funk leg passing, more or less, the leg passing game. So having this whole new dimension of mat wrestling that people weren't aware of really put him over the rest of the crowd as a wrestler in college. He had this crazy pin streak. He was super dominant. Two straight NCAA titles, two finals appearances before that. I think he like almost teched Jake Herbert, who was an Olympic silver medalist after that, or did tech Jake Herbert. But he was just fantastic in college, and a lot of it was because he had this knowledge that other people didn't have, and he was just such a great mat wrestler. He was still putting himself in terrible positions on his shots, um, like a less athletic Khabib in a sense, where he's just kind of getting to the legs and working it out from there. Uh, in MMA, that worked for him for a while because he's super durable and his mat wrestling translated fantastically to having a ground game. He picked up jiu-jitsu pretty quickly, I would say. Um, and just at the base level, he was fighting people who, in terms of like wrestling competency, weren't really there yet, so he could do whatever he wanted to them for a lot of these guys. But when he started fighting people who had a little more base competency, like Jay Huron, it became really, really difficult to work through those positions because he couldn't establish the range like he wanted to. He's just kind of walking forward and eating shots to get his range. He didn't really have like a way to get where he wanted. He just had a way to get somewhere adjacent and then work his way in from there, and that's not a style that's going to age well, and it didn't age well. Um, and I talk about that a lot more in the article, but hopefully this whole podcast answers that question from my lovely patron whose name I have a hard time pronouncing. But yeah, those are the kinds of things I'd like to talk about in this podcast. I can also give you updates on like what's going on in the world of wrestling and like who are the wrestlers coming up right now in MMA. I haven't talked about it enough, but shout out to Max Roscoff, who wrestled for NC State D1. He was ranked around or in the top 10 for a couple years, and he's a really interesting guy whose wrestling is translating fantastically. So if you like mat wrestlers, if you like guys like Habib and Ben Askren, where they do their best work once they get it to the ground, Roscoff's your guy. And I haven't studied his fights enough to get a sense of what his like takedown system is yet. But at the level he's been fighting, I don't think he needs one right now, but it's something that I'm looking for in the future. But yeah, he has picked up jujitsu alarmingly quickly, which makes sense because he was like a phenomenal leg rider in college and a phenomenal mat wrestler in Turner, and he was excellent in these positions that they made, like they turned into stalling positions because no one could stop him once he was like in a side headlock. Um, but yeah, he's catching all these funky moves. I mean, just amazing, amazing mat wrestler. He was basically not having to take anyone down. He could just go 0-0 in the first period, ride out the second period, get an escape in the third period, and win matches 2-0. And he was doing that to great guys. Um, All Star Classic, I think his senior year, he pinned All American. I think he was an All American. Brian Murphy from Michigan. I think he like caught him. He scrambled with him and caught him on his back, but it might have been that match or another match where they're in the scramble position and Roscoff more or less throws up an inverted triangle and pins somebody with that. Um, but he's awesome and he's been doing some crazy stuff to people in MMA. So I'm really looking forward to how his game translates. And then a big shout out to Joey Davis, who is the only four-time undefeated national champion in Division II in college. He wrestled for Notre Dame College. The whole Notre Dame College crew, those guys are all in MMA right now, and they all seem to be picking up the intricacies pretty quickly. Joey trains with Antonio McKee, who obviously trains his son AJ. And from what I've seen and from what I've heard, they're doing the right things. They understand it. Joey's already shown he has a very good understanding of the overhand to level change dynamic, and he's got a nice little kicking game to go with it, which is nice. Um, but yeah, really looking forward to Joey's career. He's another double leg artist, and yeah, he knows how to set it up. He gets how the overhand works into the double leg. Um, and he's what, like 7-0 at this point, but he's only been training full time for about a year. So to pick that up that quickly is great. Who else? Who else? Someone I'm a little sad about is Ed Ruth, a three-time national champion for Penn State. I think he rushed his career, and I just think his training situation hasn't been ideal. I think he's at AKA now, and before that he was at like Dethrone base camp with Josh Koscheck, and he's been learning the competencies of MMA, but he doesn't have a game. He very clearly doesn't have a game. He just kind of fights, and he's like, okay, time to wrestle, and then he'll wrestle, and like I said, base skill competency against a lot of his opponents, that works. Just because they can't wrestle as well as he can in a vacuum, and he can just get to the whatever positions he wants, and it doesn't really matter if he set it up well. Well, now he's kind of running into guys who can deal with that if it's not set up well, and he's having a hard time. So I hope Ed Ruth gets some brain power into his camp uh, to try to figure out how he can, be more efficient with his strengths. But it might not happen because AKA isn't really that gym. Uh, it's weird because like Daniel Cormier in college was like a really good re-attack, uh, front headlock. Like he had the Okie State style where he's like great inside trip, great upper body, great counters, great like slide bys, stuff like that. Like kind of a counter style. And in MMA, he's like, okay, if I want to get to my ties and my collars and my upper body positions, I will just pressure fight and I'll just like barrel forward and I'll get people in these positions. Whereas I think if he developed more of a counter fighting boxing game, like something a little more slick that not like Juicy A Formiga, but similar. It doesn't have to be as mobile, but I think he could have applied some of those similar concepts to get to his stronger positions. But he picked a game where he kind of sells out on his durability, which I mean it's worked fairly well for him, but I just don't think he's wrestling as efficiently as he could be given his style. Um, so yeah, I know this was pretty disorganized. That's my fault. But I'm just kind of trying to lay out the ground here of what this is going to be like. Hopefully, I'll find some more structure as we go. I think I'll probably focus on one or two people or case studies per episode. Um, yeah, maybe next one I'll talk more about Khabib just because that fight may or may not be coming up. I can kind of just give you an audio rundown of that article I wrote, so I can explain a little more what I mean when I say that I have issues with his neutral wrestling. Um, but yeah, I will take requests depending on how in depth the request is or how big the request is. Um, Ultimately, I'm probably going to point you towards our Patreon account and the $10 tier for asking questions. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. I know a lot of you on Twitter said you'd be interested. I hope this is what you thought it would be. Um, but yeah, I'll explain a lot more in the future. I think this is something I can do more moving forward, and yeah, I'm just gonna run with this version. I think this is fine for now, and yeah, I hope you enjoy. See you later.